Loved You Better Than You Knew by Mrs. McVeigh Miller. Copyright 1897, now in the public domain. Chapter 9. A Bunch of Roses. Cinthia had never spent such an unhappy day in the whole of her young life. She could not realize that only yesterday she had been railing at the monotony of existence. It was only 24 hours later, and a tragedy of woe had overwhelmed her in its grim embrace. Only yesterday she had been planning and hoping and wishing for some way to know Arthur better, and now he was won. Now he was her promised husband, and through all the bitterness of her father's cruelty, that thought made glad her warm heart. She had shed little rivers of tears. She had sulked at her father and aunt. She had refused to eat her dinner, and pouted among the pillows all day long. But through it all ran one thrilling thought. Arthur was coming to take her away tonight. He had promised, and she knew he would keep his word. When her aunt went down about her household duties, she laughed to herself at the thought of outwitting those two, her cold-hearted aunt and her cruel father. The thought of their surprise, when they should find her gone in the morning, was pure delight. "There he goes. I wish he would go and stay forever," she cried petulantly, as she heard the gate latch click, and springing to the window, saw her father walking away into the gloomy distance. She sat down and watched him out of sight, adding, "He is very handsome and noble-looking, and if he had treated me better, I should have learned to love him well. But now I hate and fear him, and I would die before I would go with him tomorrow. Dear, dear Arthur, I hope nothing will prevent him from taking me away tonight." And while she was moping, her aunt came up with a magnificent bunch of roses, saying kindly, "Cheer up now, Cinthy. Here's a splendid big nosegay for you and a box of French candy. I suppose your pa sent it because he went down into the town a while ago and said he'd get you a present." "I don't want any of his presents. Take them away," Cinthia answered angrily. "Don't be a little fool, Cinthy. I'm getting out of patience with your airs," Mrs. Flint returned severely, putting down the gifts and slamming the door as she stalked out. Cinthia loved flowers dearly, and the scent of the roses wooed her to caress them presently, burying her face in the fragrant red and white beauties. A note hidden among them scratched the tip of her nose, and she drew it out with a cry of wonder. It was from Arthur and ran thus: "I have thought it all over, darling, and I think the only way for us is to elope to Washington tonight and be married. I do not like to steal a man's daughter away from him this way, but his obstinacy leaves us no other hope. And as there is really no reason to prevent our marrying, I hope he will soon be reconciled. No doubt Mother will help us to bring him around afterward. She is so very clever. And I shall not let her into the secret of tonight, so that he cannot accuse her of connivance in our plans. I will be waiting near your house with a carriage at 12 o'clock tonight, and you must slip out and join me. Then it is only 2 miles to the station, and away we go on the midnight train to Washington. Keep up your courage, my sweet love, for we are going to be the happiest pair in the world. Arthur." Cinthia refused to go down to supper, and made a meal of sweetmeats. The hours between dark and midnight seemed endless. She heard her aunt retire to her room at an early hour, and her father later on. The house was wrapped for an hour in profound silence. Then she heard the hall clock chiming 12. Cinthia was all ready, even to her hat and jacket, her face pale with eagerness, her heart throbbing wildly. She stepped to the door and turned the knob. Horrors! It did not yield to her touch. They had suspected her and locked her into the room. An impulse came to her to shriek aloud in her wrath and defiance, and to try and batter down the door and escape. But a timely thought restrained her, and she drew back from the temptation, her eyes flaming luridly, her temper raging. "They shall not baffle us, the cunning wretches. Arthur, my love, I am coming to you, though the whole world oppose," she cried wildly, rushing to the window and throwing up the sash. It had been snowing steadily for hours, though she did not know it. As she leaned out into the darkness, a great gust of wind and big swirling flakes of snow stormed into the room, blowing out the light and clasping her in a cold embrace. Chapter 10. A Feminine Weakness. In the small compass of thy clasping arms, in reach and sight of thy dear lips and eyes, there, for me the joy of heaven lies. Outside, lo, chaos, terrors, wild alarms, and all the desolation fierce and fell, a void and aching nothingness makes hell. Ella Wheeler Wilcox. The night was black as Erebus. The wind cut like a knife, and the air was full of blinding snow that must have been falling for hours. It was banked so heavily against the window ledge, almost freezing Cynthia's hands as they plunged into it on leaning forward. For though she gasped and caught her breath as the wild elements blew in her face and tried to beat her back, she did not recoil from her fixed purpose, which was to drop out upon the top of the porch and climb down to the ground by the aid of a honeysuckle vine that wreathed over the trellis frame at one end. The icy blast that shrieked in her ears was not enough to chill the fiery ardor of her resentment at her father, and the yearning of her heart for the dear lover from whom she feared to be separated forever. Her tender young heart went out to him with an intensity of feeling as she peered out into the stormy darkness of the night, wondering if he was there waiting, and if he was growing impatient at her delay. "Ah, my love," she murmured impetuously, "I am coming to you. Neither bolts nor bars, nor storm nor darkness, nor anything under heaven shall keep us apart." The wind whistled past the eaves and seemed to take on an almost human voice of sorrowing, as though it echoed those dismal words, "Shall keep us apart, shall keep us apart." Cinthia caught her breath and listened. It was so strange, that almost human wail of the wind, sighing through the great pine tree on the corner. It seemed to be sobbing, "Apart, apart." "How mournful it sounds," she uttered in an awe-stricken tone. Then she climbed through the window and dropped with a dull thud out on the porch. Mrs. Flint heard the sound in her adjoining room and muttered drowsily, "It is the snow sliding down from off the roof." Cinthia crawled to the edge of the porch and felt out carefully for the thick mat of the honeysuckle. She knew she was making a desperate venture, but she said to herself bitterly that desperate emergencies require desperate remedies. With infinite care and patience, she managed to get hold of the strong matted vines and swung herself carefully over the trellis, beginning to make the perilous descent with bated breath, for a fall might mean a broken limb, or, at least, a sprained ankle. The wet snow clung to her face and garments and chilled her to the bone, but she persevered, though the high wind threatened to loosen her hold and blow her down every instant. What did she care for it all, poor Cinthia, fleeing from her dull life and her hated persecutors to the tender arms of love? She would endure anything rather than be cheated of her happiness. The cold snow flecked her benumbed face and hands. The high wind swung her light form to and fro like a flower upon the vine. Her breath seemed to freeze on her lips, but her courage never flagged. Out there in the night and the storm, her lover was waiting. The thought kept her young heart warm. She was more than halfway down now, and the wind began to lull. "Courage, Cinthia. The danger will soon be over, sweetheart, and love rewarded for its brave struggles." But alas, how often bathos overcomes pathos. Cinthia was only a girl, after all, with the usual feminine attributes. As she swung herself carefully from branch to branch of the vine, hoping and longing for her feet to touch terra firma, yet sustained by unfaltering courage, there came to her a sudden wild and terrifying thought that made the blood run colder in her veins than all the raging storm had forced to do. She had remembered that of late the immense vine to which she clung had afforded a delightful gymnasium for a score or so of large rodents, causing her aunt to threaten to cut it down. The feminine mind has one idiosyncrasy known of all men, and accordingly ridiculed but never overcome. Cinthia did not pretend to be stronger than her sex. With that sudden, terrifying thought, an uncontrollable shriek burst from her lips, her numb hands relaxed their grasp, and she went crashing down through space plump into a great bank of drifted snow blown into a heap below the vine. Everard Dawn heard that shriek as he tossed on his pillow in restless dreams, and suddenly raised his head. "What a night!" he cried, for he had been watching the storm ere he retired. "How the wind howls tonight, shrieking like a human voice through that splendid pine on the corner. How I used to love the wind in the pines in my far southern home until afterward. But since then it is an embodied grief to me, as in the plaint of one of our southern poets. I hear the wind in the pines with the soughing of wordless woe and the whisper of leafless vines, like a sad heart's overflow. Sigh on, they seem to say, sigh on, sad heart, to the night, for the world is cold and gray, and life has no delight." He listened with his head on his arm, but the wind had lulled for the moment, and the strangely human shriek he had heard began to affect him very unpleasantly. Was it really the wind? He began to ask himself, wondering if it might not be an hysterical shriek of his rebellious daughter. "Poor little Cinthia, God help her," he uttered sadly, and rising from his bed, began to dress hurriedly. "I will go and see if there is anything wrong," he muttered. He had been very angry when he returned at dusk from his strange interview with the scornful Mrs. Varian, and heard from his worried sister about the flowers and candy she had taken up to Cinthia. "How is my little girl now?" he asked anxiously, and started when she replied, "She is in a dreadful temper, and when I took up the flowers and candy you sent her, she ordered me to throw them away." "Did you do it?" "No. I told her not to be a little fool, put them down on the table, and came away. Rebecca, I fear you have made a grave mistake. I did not send Cinthia anything. I intended to purchase a gift for her, but I was so troubled I quite forgot it." Mrs. Flint studied a moment, then frankly admitted that the boy who brought the flowers had not said Mr. Dawn sent them, had merely said for Miss Cinthia, and she had jumped at the conclusion that they came from her brother. "They must have come from Arthur Varian. I take this very ill of him after what I said to him this morning," angrily. "Are you sure," he continued, "that no letter accompanied the flowers?" "I did not see any," the old lady replied uneasily. Everard Dawn was more versed in the ways of romantic lovers than his prosaic sister, so he said with a troubled air, "You may be sure that a sentimental note accompanied the gift, and they may possibly have planned an elopement this very night. I desire that you will lock her door on the outside without her knowledge when you retire tonight." "Very well," she replied, and obeyed him to the letter. Recalling all this, the thought came to him that perhaps Cinthia, finding her door locked, was indulging herself in a fit of hysterics. "God help us all," he sighed, as he finished dressing and, taking his night-lamp, stole upstairs to listen outside her door. But all was still as death at first. Then the wind rose again, and he heard strange noises within the room. It was, in fact, the wind rushing through the window and banging things about in confusion. He went and tapped on Mrs. Flint's door, and she soon confronted him in her cap and gown, exclaiming, "I thought I heard creaking steps in the hall. What is the matter? Are you ill, Everard?" "No, but I fancied I heard strange noises from Cynthia's room. Did you notice anything?" "I heard the snow sliding off the roof, and the wind shrieking in the branches of that great pine out there. It always sounds so human in a storm that I would cut it down, only that Deacon Flint set store by it. He said he planted it when he was a little boy. But I will go in and peep at Cinthia just to ease your mind, Everard." "Shh! We must not wake her if she is asleep," turning the knob with a cautious hand and opening wide the door. Whew! How the cold air rushed in her face and thrust her back. By the light that Everard carried, she saw the window wide open and the snowflakes flying in on the carpet. Why, how strange that the window should be open. Cinthia must be crazy. Wait till I shut it, Everard, and bring in the light. He obeyed, and when he entered, they saw what had happened. The room was empty, and Cinthia was gone. Mrs. Flint could not believe it at first. She ran all about the room and then all over the house, crying in a wild dismay, "Cinthia! Cinthia! Cinthia! Where are you hiding, honey?" But no reply came back, and very soon the unhappy father found out the truth. She had actually escaped by way of the window. Securing a lantern from the kitchen, he went out for a short while and returned with a very accurate report. She had slid down the honeysuckle vine to the ground, and there were tracks in the snow leading to a sleigh that had been in waiting not far away. The marks of the runners were quite distinct in spite of the drifting snow. "She has eloped with Arthur Varian. I must follow and bring them back," he said with terrible calmness. "Yes, for I found the letter that must have come with the flowers blowing about the floor of her room," she answered, giving it to him. He read it, groaned bitterly, and thrust it into his pocket. "I must pursue them," he said again. "Tell me where to find the nearest livery stable, Rebecca." "It is 1/2 a mile," she said, giving him clear directions, but adding, "Oh, Everard, you will not venture out in such a storm. You may catch your death of cold." "You know not what you talk of, my sister. I would rather catch my death, as you say, than permit Arthur Varian to marry Cinthia Dawn," he hurled back at her, hoarsely, as he rushed from the house out into the night and storm. Chapter 11. Cynthia's Elopement. Meanwhile, Cynthia's fall and shriek had been heard by other alert ears, no less than Arthur Varian's, who had been waiting impatiently in the shadow of the trees for 10 minutes, wondering whether Cinthia would come or not, fearing lest the fury of the storm should daunt her courage and hold her back. With his eager eyes on her window, he presently saw the sash fly up and Cynthia's beautiful face and form outlined against the background of the lighted room. The next moment the gale blew in and extinguished the lamp and darkened the beautiful picture. But in that moment he saw enough to relieve his fears. Cinthia wore her hat and jacket ready for traveling. She was coming to him, his brave little darling, and out yonder waited a swift horse and sleigh, and plenty of cozy buffalo robes to shelter her from the cold in their swift drive to the station. He advanced to the gate, and stood with his eyes fixed on the door, eager to give her a joyous welcome when she appeared, lest the thick darkness frighten her back. Then his ears caught the soft thud on the top of the porch, and, like Mrs. Flint, he thought at first it might be snow sliding off the roof. The wind arose with a great bang and clatter among the loose shutters, deadening the sound of the branches as Cinthia swung herself off the vine and began her descent to the ground, while her eager lover strained his eyes through the thick darkness, watching the door to see her come. Then suddenly the wind lulled so that he could catch his breath, and he heard a soft rustling in the vines as if they strained under a dead weight. "Heavens, what is that?" he muttered, with a half-suspicion of the truth, and, tearing open the gate, he rushed across the yard through the wet, impeding snow, already 1/2 a foot deep, to the corner of the house, just as Cinthia shrieked and fell into the little bank of drifted snow so soft and cold. With a bound, Arthur was by her side, stretching out eager hands, crying in a passion of love and grief, "Cinthia, dearest, are you hurt?" He reached down and gathered her up like a child in his strong arms. "Oh, my love, my treasure, what a terrible risk you ran for me. Tell me if you are hurt," she whispered nervously against his breast. "I don't think I am, only frightened almost to death. I thought every bone would be broken, but the snow was as soft as a feather bed. Oh, let us get away, Arthur, before they hear us. You may carry me if you will. I am trembling so." her teeth chattering so that she could scarcely speak. "That's what I meant to do," Arthur replied, managing to find her face somehow in the darkness and imprint a kiss upon it ere he strode away with her to the sleigh, and tucked her in among the robes so that not a breath of cold could reach her, while he kept up her courage with the tenderest words, assuring her that she should never repent trusting herself to him. "Oh, how dark it is! How shall you find your way along the dark country road?" she cried in alarm. "Don't you see my sleigh lamps? Besides, I know the road well. I shall have to drive slowly, but that will not matter, as there is no one in pursuit, and the train is not due till 1 o'clock," returned Arthur confidently, as he seated himself, took the reins, and chirruped to his fleet pony. Cinthia snuggled up to his side and sobbed and laughed hysterically till he almost exhausted the whole vocabulary of love words before she said, "Oh, Arthur, I must tell you why I fell, and you will not call me your brave little heroine any more, but only the greatest coward in the world." And the wicked young elopers, flying through the storm and darkness of night toward the happy haven of marriage, laughed together till they almost forgot their surroundings at Cynthia's sudden fear, while vowing but a moment before to fly to Arthur though the whole world oppose. To be frightened at the thought of a rat, not at a rat, but just the bare thought of touching one lurking in the vines, was it not utterly ridiculous? She queried, though not at all sure but that she would do the same thing again. Arthur could only laugh at her confession and rejoice that she had sustained no hurt from her fall, so they sped along through the night and storm, each very, very happy in their youthful love, and confident of forgiveness from the obdurate father when he should learn that they were married. "We shall be in Washington by breakfast time tomorrow, and will go at once to a minister and have the ceremony over. Then we will telegraph your father and my mother that we are one, and that we shall spend our honeymoon north," said the young man, planning everything happily without a thought of failure. "Papa will be simply furious," laughed Cinthia. "But he cannot take me away from you and send me off to school, thank heaven, as he proposed to do. And as for his forgiveness, I feel quite indifferent to it. I don't care if I never see his face again. But your mother, what will she say, Arthur? Perhaps she preferred for you to marry some beautiful, rich girl?" anxiously. Arthur squeezed her to his side with one free arm as he replied gaily, "Don't worry over that, love. For my mother was so charmed with your beauty and sweetness last night that I felt sure she would be glad to have you for a daughter, so I made bold to propose to you on the way to your house, and told her all about it at breakfast this morning. Dear heart, she has never crossed a wish of mine since I was born, and she said I had taken her by surprise. But she would give me her blessing, and did not care how soon we set the wedding day. It would be so pleasant to have a young girl in the house. Was she not a darling? So when I came to ask for your hand this morning, and your father snubbed me so cruelly, I did not have the heart to go back to her then, for I feared she might not countenance an elopement, the Varians are so proud. I stayed away, making arrangements for our flitting, and sent her a note that I had gone off on a sudden trip and would wire particulars. But bless you, she will be all right when she hears we are married, though she will never forgive your father for crossing the will of her spoiled boy." Laughing and chatting happily in the joy of being together, they drove along very slowly for fear of an accident, and because Arthur thought they had plenty of time to reach the station. But suddenly and most inexplicably, the gentle little pony began to balk, starting backward so quickly as to almost throw the occupants out of the sleigh. At the same time it began to neigh in a frightened way, requiring all of Arthur's skill to reassure it. Trembling violently and neighing distressfully, it stood still in the road, refusing to budge forward an inch. "He is frightened, poor fellow, at some little obstruction in the road. I had better get out and remove it," said Arthur, giving Cinthia the reins and springing out into the snow. Giving the trembling pony a reassuring pat and word, he passed him and went on to examine the road. Cinthia heard him cry out in alarm and wonder as he stooped down. "Oh, what is it?" she exclaimed curiously. "Cinthia, there is a human being lying here unconscious in the snow. A woman." "Oh, heavens!" "What shall we do?" continued Arthur distressfully. "Oh, Arthur, we must take her into the sleigh with us and carry her to the station. Oh, how terrible to fall down unconscious in the snow on such a wild night!" cried Cinthia, beginning to sob with sympathy, the cold air turning the tears into pearls upon her cheeks. Without more ado, Arthur dragged the inert form up out of the snow, and staggering under the heavy weight of a large unconscious woman, managed to deposit his burden in the bottom of the sleigh, after which he got in himself, saying, as he took up the reins, "I am sorry this happened, because it will draw upon us undesirable notoriety at the station. But it cannot be helped now, and I must hasten on, for I have driven so slowly that we have not much time to spare." But just as they started off, he caught the sudden sound of sleigh bells and the neigh of a horse quickly gaining on them, as a loud, angry voice thundered, "Halt, or I fire! Choose death or instant surrender!" Chapter 12. Outwitted. As nearly hopeless as Everard Dawn's pursuit of the fugitives had appeared even to himself when he began it, he had succeeded better than he could have expected. His only hope had been to catch them at the station before the arrival of the train, but, owing to Arthur's careful driving in the storm, he had overtaken them while yet half a mile from the station. He had run all the way to the livery stable, and as soon as a sleigh was furnished, leaped in and drove off at the highest speed possible in the condition of the weather, his mind wrought to the highest tension of trouble, rendering him unconscious of personal danger. As the horse trotted briskly along, under the urging of voice and whip, the light sleigh rocked from side to side, almost overturning twice, but eventually gaining on Arthur's horse, until he perceived the stoppage in the road by the light that streamed from Arthur's lamps upon the snow. He heard their voices blending with the wind. He saw something lifted into the sleigh, and wondered if his daughter had fallen out. Then, as Arthur leaped in and chirruped to his pony, he rose in his seat and shouted furiously, "Halt, or I fire! Choose between death or instant surrender!" And to emphasize his words, he instantly fired into the air, making both their horses snort and rear with terror. Arthur's only reply was to touch his horse with the whip, making it bound furiously forward. A most unequal race ensued, Arthur's sleigh being encumbered with the weight of 3, while Mr. Dawn was quite alone. 1, 2, 3 minutes, and Mr. Dawn's horse flashed past Arthur's. Then he drove across the front of the road, shouting hoarsely, "Stop! There will be a collision!" Cinthia had slipped down senseless in her seat, and nothing but surrender was possible now. With a silent curse at his evil fate, Arthur pulled the lines, forcing his plunging pony to a standstill, as Everard Dawn continued menacingly, "I do not wish to harm you, Mr. Varian, but you must give me back my daughter." Arthur felt like a coward, but he realized that no other course was possible now. With a groan, he answered, "I would rather part with my life than this dear girl, Mr. Dawn. Oh, think a moment, before you sunder our loving hearts, of the despair you are bringing into both our lives." Everard Dawn drove back to the side of the sleigh where Arthur waited and said, sternly, "Cinthia." "She is unconscious, sir." "Ah, then, it was Cinthia you lifted into the sleigh. Is she hurt?" "It was not Cinthia, but an unconscious woman I found in the road." "If Cinthia is unconscious, so much the better. We will have no scene with her in transferring her to my charge, and she will not hear what I must say to you." "Speak on, sir," Arthur answered most bitterly in his keen resentment, and Mr. Dawn began, "I think very hardly of you, Arthur Varian, for disregarding my words to you this morning. I said frankly to you that reasons of the gravest import forbid the marriage of yourself and Cinthia." "I had a right to be informed of those reasons, sir," Arthur said hotly. "Say you so? Then go to your mother, Arthur Varian, and ask of her the reason why my daughter can never be your wife." Arthur started in surprise that this man should know aught of his mother, but answered quickly, "She cannot know anything against it, since only this morning she gave her pleased consent." "She knows better now, and I say again, go to her and ask her for the truth," replied Everard Dawn as he stepped out of the sleigh to take possession of Cinthia. Arthur was before him. He lifted the inanimate form in his arms and kissed the cold white face in despairing love before he resigned her to the impatient father's arms. "Ah, you cannot surely guess of what a priceless treasure you are robbing me, Mr. Dawn. May heaven judge between us whether you have been merciful to me," he cried reproachfully. "I rest my cause with heaven," Mr. Dawn answered reverently as he placed Cinthia in the sleigh, covered her with warm robes, and drove away with a cold good night to the young man, who continued his course to the station as fast as he could urge his horse to go. In his agony of grief at losing his beautiful promised bride, and in hot resentment of what he deemed hardness of heart in her father, Arthur Varian had yielded without reflection upon the baseness of it, to a sudden, overmastering temptation. His caresses and emotion on handing the unconscious woman to Mr. Dawn had been simply a superb bit of acting. It was the poor waif of the road he had placed in the arms of Everard Dawn, thus completely outwitting the unhappy father while he drove rapidly on to the station, hoping to board the train before his deception was discovered. In a moment the few scattering midnight lights of the railway town began to appear, and Cinthia gasped and opened her eyes, beginning to sob with alarm. "Oh, oh, oh!" "It is all right, darling. We have distanced our pursuers," said Arthur cheerfully. "And here we are at the station, and the train is coming. We have not time to go into the waiting room." He helped her out and called a boy to whom he entrusted his sleigh, telling him to return it to Idlewild next day and pressing a liberal reward into his willing hand. Then he helped the bewildered Cinthia aboard the train and led her at once to a stove, saying tenderly, "Warm yourself, my darling, while I try to secure seats in the parlor car." "It is very unfortunate indeed," said the conductor, "but the Pullman sleeper is crowded. Only one berth was vacant when they came into the station, and it has just been engaged by a lady en route for New York." The lady had indeed just taken possession of her berth, brushing haughtily past without taking notice of either. Neither did Arthur notice her, or he would have seen with surprise that it was his own mother. Deeply chagrined that he could not get quarters for Cinthia in the parlor car, he returned to her side, and they spent the hours very happily till morning. Chapter 13. Oh, what a night! All unconscious of the deception that had been practiced on him, Everard Dawn drove briskly back to his home, making no effort to restore Cinthia, and, in fact, rather hoping that her unconsciousness would last until he could place her in Mrs. Flint's care. In common with most men, he had a holy horror of sensational scenes, and shrunk from hearing his daughter's reproaches when she should revive and find herself so cruelly sundered from her lover. So he made haste to reach home, and his thoughts on the way were most sad and bitter, for in this man's past was a tragedy of sorrow that might have driven a weaker man to cut loose the bonds of unbearable life with his own hands and hurl himself recklessly into the great unknown future beyond. With his return to his sister's house, everything had rushed back upon him like the swell of some great river, and seared wounds had been opened afresh, bleeding in secret beneath his outward calmness. However handsome and prosperous he appeared to the outward eye, no man could have envied Everard Dawn, having looked once into his tortured heart and seen its secrets laid bare. Mrs. Flint was watching and listening for him, and as soon as the sleigh stopped, she seized a lantern, and bundling herself in a shawl, rushed out to the gate. Springing out and fastening the lines to a post, he said triumphantly, "I overtook them, Rebecca, and Cinthia fainted with fear. I brought her back in that condition, thus escaping a scene in the sleigh. I will carry her in, and you can revive her at your leisure, while I return the sleigh to the stable." He lifted out the form, carefully shrouded in a large, warm robe, and, almost staggering under the burden, followed the lead of his sister into the sitting-room, depositing it, on the long sofa, panting. "Cynthia looks so slender. I did not suppose she was so heavy. My arms fairly ache. Now do you revive her, Rebecca, and soothe the poor girl as tenderly as you can until I return presently." Well, I declare, I never saw such an unfeeling father in my life. There he rushes off again, without so much as glancing at her face to see if she is dead or alive. He doesn't seem to bear one bit of love for the poor neglected girl, and I wish in my heart she had got away with Arthur Varian and married him. That I do, ejaculated the old lady, as she heard her brother drive away, her usually cold heart melting with sympathy for the hapless girl over whom she bent, drawing aside the folds of the heavy robe from her face, adding sharply, "And a pretty howdy-do there'll be when she revives and finds herself parted from her lover. Not that I believe he can keep them apart, for there's an old saying that true love always finds a way, and— Oh, my goodness gracious! What in the world?" With that dismayed exclamation, the widow Flint dropped the corner of the robe and recoiled as if she had encountered a nest of serpents. It was not quite so bad as that, but she certainly had good reason for her surprise and dismay, for instead of her beautiful niece, slender, golden-haired Cinthia, there lay a large woman of middle age, shabbily attired, with a pinched face, whose cadaverous hue was outlined by long, straggling locks of jet-black hair. "Dead!" cried Mrs. Flint in horror, and the shock to her nerves was so great that she rushed from the room and banged open the front door, calling wildly down the road, "Everard! Everard, come back!" But the homeless wind and the vagrant snow blew mockingly in her face, and no other sound came back, so she knew it was all in vain to stand there shouting for one who could not hear. What a night! What a night! And what a mistake Everard has made! Or is he only playing a foolish joke on me? Who is the woman, anyway? I never saw her face in these parts before. And presently, conquering her terror, she stole back into the room for a second look. The strange intruder lay there speechless, motionless, as if life had indeed fled from her body. Mrs. Flint ventured to touch her hand, and it felt like ice. "She is frozen to death," she muttered pityingly. "Oh, how I wish Everard would return and explain this mysterious thing. I had better feel her heart. Why, it seems to beat faintly, poor creature. I wish I knew just what to do to bring her to life, for this is just awful. Oh, what a night!" But, leaving poor Mrs. Flint to her dazed condition and perplexity, we must follow the eloping couple as their train rushed on through the night and darkness to Washington. They had spent several happy hours together on the train, heedless of the other passengers, who mostly slept or talked together, apparently taking slight notice of the young pair, who sat apart conversing with shy dignity, and permitting themselves no slightest caresses, such as might have drawn ready ridicule upon their love. Almost before they realized it, the day dawned, and the train rushed into the city on time at 8 o'clock. Arthur took a carriage, and he and his bride-to-be were driven to a hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue, where he always stopped when visiting the city. Calling the proprietor aside, he said, in his most genial fashion, "As I have known you a long time, sir, I wish to say that I desire to be married to the young lady who accompanies me before I register our names. Can you send out for the nearest minister?" The host congratulated him and answered laughingly, "Cupid never was in such luck before, for the Reverend Dr. Sprague is in the office at this moment, having called in to inquire about a subscription for his new church. You will both please step into the parlor, and I will bring him there in a jiffy." Cinthia was all in a tremor now. "Must I not even bathe my face and brush my hair first?" she queried, clinging to him. "No, love, not till the little ceremony is over. I cannot rest till I know you are mine and out of your father's power," Arthur cried ardently. "And see, there is the minister. Be brave, love. It will all be over in a moment." "Dr. Sprague, Mr. Varian and his intended bride. I am to be the best man and give the bride away," said the host genially, and the minister bowed and opened his book, saying, "I should like 2 witnesses, please. Perhaps that lady looking out of the window will oblige us."